Why the U.S. military intervention in Venezuela is worse than you think. For decades, the United States has framed its military power as a stabilizing force, one that deters aggression, protects democracy, and enforces international order. But in early 2026, that image took a serious hit when U.S. forces conducted a direct military operation inside Venezuela, striking targets in Caracas and capturing President Nicolás Maduro. To some observers, the action looked decisive. A long-standing adversary removed, a corrupt regime disrupted, a show of American resolve in its own hemisphere. But beneath the surface, this intervention carries consequences far more dangerous than most people realize. This wasn't just another foreign operation. It was a fundamental break with long-standing norms, and the ripple effects are already spreading. To understand why this intervention is so destabilizing, you have to understand what actually happened and what led to it. The U.S. did not wake up one morning and decide to invade Venezuela. This moment was the culmination of years of escalation across legal, economic, and political fronts. For over a decade, the United States has treated Venezuela less like a traditional adversary and more like a criminal enterprise masquerading as a state. Sanctions tightened, diplomatic recognition shifted, criminal indictments were issued against senior Venezuelan leadership, including Nicolás Maduro himself, who was formally charged by the U.S. with narcotics trafficking and conspiracy. That distinction matters. Once the U.S. publicly labeled a sitting head of state as a criminal rather than a political actor, it fundamentally reframed the relationship. Venezuela was no longer treated as a hostile government to be contained. It was treated as a law enforcement target. At the same time, Venezuela's internal collapse accelerated. Economic freefall, mass migration, and increasing reliance on foreign security assistance, particularly from Cuba, created a perception in Washington that the regime was both illegitimate and vulnerable. The U.S. decision to act was driven by three overlapping calculations. First, political opportunity. Venezuelan state capacity had eroded to the point where resistance to a rapid, targeted operation was assessed as manageable. The regime still existed, but its control was thin. Second, legal framing. By treating Maduro as an indicted criminal rather than a protected sovereign leader, U.S. leadership believed it could justify action as enforcement rather than war, even if that distinction would not be accepted internationally. Third, strategic signaling. The operation was meant to demonstrate that the U.S. was willing to use force decisively in its own hemisphere again, after years of restraint elsewhere. The operation itself was short, precise, and overwhelming. U.S. forces struck select targets in Caracas, degraded regime security elements, and executed a direct action raid that resulted in the capture of Nicolás Maduro and key figures from his inner circle. He was extracted from Venezuelan territory and transferred to U.S. custody to face charges already filed in American courts. From a purely tactical standpoint, the mission succeeded. From a strategic standpoint, it opened a Pandora's box. Because the moment the U.S. crossed the border, struck a capital city, and removed a sitting president by force, the issue stopped being about Maduro. It became about precedent. At its core, the U.S. action in Venezuela was a unilateral use of military force against a sovereign state. There was no United Nations Security Council authorization, there was no collective regional mandate, and there was no imminent military threat to the United States that would justify self-defense under international law. Instead, the operation was justified after the fact as a form of law enforcement, a mission to capture a criminal leader accused of narcotics trafficking. That framing matters because it represents a dangerous redefinition of military force. Law enforcement actions do not involve bombing another country's capital or deploying special operations forces without consent. Once a military crosses borders, conducts strikes, and extracts a head of state, the line between policing and warfare disappears. This matters because the U.S. has spent decades insisting that sovereignty and territorial integrity are non-negotiable principles. By bypassing those rules, the United States weakened the very legal framework it has relied on to condemn other nations for similar actions. When the strongest power in the system breaks the rules stop protecting anyone. The most dangerous consequences of the Venezuela intervention may not unfold in Latin America at all. They may unfold elsewhere, when other states cite U.S. behavior as justification for their own. If Washington can justify crossing borders to arrest foreign leaders accused of criminal activity, what prevents other powers from doing the same? What stops Russia from claiming a right to seize leaders it labels terrorists? What stops China from invoking internal security to justify military actions beyond its borders? The U.S. has long argued that international order depends not just on power, but on restraint. That argument becomes far harder to sustain when America acts alone, without multilateral backing, and dismisses global criticism as irrelevant. Even close allies express concern, not because they supported the Venezuelan regime, but because they recognize the long-term implications of normalizing unilateral force. This isn't about defending Maduro. It's about defending a system where rules matter more than might. Supporters of the intervention argue that removing Maduro opens the door to stability and democratic reform, but history suggests the opposite outcome is more likely. Latin America has a deep collective memory of foreign intervention. Even governments critical of Venezuela's leadership reacted with alarm, not relief, because they understand how quickly external military action can ignite nationalist backlash. Instead of weakening internal resistance, intervention often strengthens it. Political factions that previously opposed Maduro now face pressure to rally against what they perceive as foreign aggression. Armed groups gain legitimacy by framing themselves as defenders of sovereignty. Civil unrest becomes harder to manage, not easier. The intervention also raised tensions with regional actors like Cuba, which reported casualties among its personnel in Venezuela. That alone risks widening the crisis beyond Venezuela's borders. Instability doesn't stay contained. It spills across borders through migration, crime, and political polarization. The very problems the U.S. claims to want to limit, regional disorder and insecurity, are often intensified by military action. Short-term tactical success does not equal long-term stability. Another problem with the U.S. intervention is that its stated goals don't align. At times, the mission was framed as counter-narcotics enforcement. At other moments, U.S. leadership openly discussed controlling Venezuela's oil production and running the country until it stabilized. Those are not the same objectives. Counter-narcotics operations are law enforcement problems that require intelligence cooperation, financial tracking, and long-term institutional reform. Resource control and political restructuring are nation-building missions that historically demand massive investment, prolonged presence, and public legitimacy. Mixing these narratives creates confusion, both abroad and at home. When motives appear blurred between security, economics, and political influence, credibility erodes. Allies hesitate, adversaries exploit the ambiguity, local populations assume the worst. Once credibility is lost, even legitimate future actions are viewed with suspicion. Perhaps the most overlooked reality is this: Venezuela's crisis was never primarily a military problem. It is an economic collapse, a governance failure, and a legitimacy crisis. No amount of force can fix those issues. Drug trafficking, one of the main justifications cited, is driven by global demand, corruption, and transnational networks, not by the presence of a single leader. Removing Maduro does not dismantle those systems, it merely reshuffles them. Using military force to address criminal networks abroad sets an extremely dangerous precedent. If drug trafficking justifies cross-border raids, then no state is safe from intervention based on another country's domestic priorities. This logic expands national security to an unsustainable level, one where nearly any problem becomes grounds for military action. That path doesn't lead to order. It leads to perpetual conflict. The real consequences of the U.S. operation won't show up immediately. In the short term, removing Maduro created a power vacuum, not stability. Venezuela fractured further as factions competed for control. Regionally, even governments hostile to Maduro condemned the intervention, not to defend him, but to resist the precedent it set. Strategically, the message wasn't restraint. It was that the U.S. will act unilaterally when costs seem low. That encourages risk-taking elsewhere. Any short-term gains are fragile. History shows legitimacy imposed by force rarely lasts, and instability almost always fills the gap.